Good evening, everyone. Welcome to MDA's Advocacy Institute, the power of your vote. I am Shawn Hill, the Manager of Public Policy and Advocacy here at MDA. What we hope to do this evening is provide a great deal of education and talk about engagement in the electoral process. We'll have some speakers that talk about pretty much the structure, function, and operation of our government and talk about advocacy and how you might get involved. What I'd like to do at this point is turn the presentation over to my colleague, Joy Hawk, who's going to go through some housekeeping issues.
All right, thank you very much, Shawn. So just a couple of quick housekeeping items, for everybody. So we have a couple of features enabled that will allow you to interact with our panelists this evening, as well as us sort of on the back end here on the MDA side as well, to make sure that we have as many folks as possible to cover all of your questions and make sure we get you the answers that you need. So the first thing is that I'd like to remind everyone that we do have closed captioning available. This is being recorded, but we do have closed captioning available for your ease of viewing there as well. So with that note in mind as well, I do want to remind folks that we have sort of two ways for you to share input this evening. The first one being the chat function, which you'll see on your lower right-hand corner of the screen. If you have any just sort of general comments about our content this evening, we would ask that you put them in that box. And then if you have a specific question that you would like to be answered by a member of our panel or an MDA staff member, please place that in the Q&A box. And it's not the easiest to see there, but right next to the little chat icon on your lower right-hand corner, there is a three-dot little menu there. You can click that, and that will take you to the Q&A, and that'll allow us to see, which of us has answered a question already, which questions to make sure that we get to the right person to answer that question. So we do appreciate everything with you placing those in the Q&A box and in the chat. So with those reminders in mind, I will hand it back over to Shawn. Let's go. All right.
Thank you, Joy. Before we get started, I would just like to offer a bit of a disclaimer. Tonight's Advocacy Institute, as well as our Access the Vote campaign, which this is the premier event, are all based on education and engagement. There will be no discussion about particular races or particular candidates. The organization is a 501c3, therefore we cannot engage in supporting individual candidates or the like. So I just wanted to place that out there. And with that being said, let me introduce our panelists for the evening. First, we have joining us Ron Hamm. Ron is the president and CEO of Hamm Consulting Group, very well versed in government relations and public affairs. He will be walking us through the operation of our government and talking about Congress, the other branches of government, some of the particulars about what happens on the Hill, and among some of the federal agencies. We'll also be joined tonight by Chelsey Cartwright. Chelsey is the project manager at the League of Women Voters. And so we're looking forward to hearing from her about advocacy and engagement and what the average citizen can do to be a part of the electoral process. So that being said, I'm going to turn things over to Ron.
Good evening, everyone. And again, thanks to Muscular Dystrophy Association for having me on tonight. I look forward to walking us through a number of slides and a really good discussion about, really how our government works. And the key thing is, I would say, leading off on this slide is, to really engage with the federal government or really any level of government, you need to understand how it works. So that is going to be the goal tonight in terms of, how our government was set up, of course, based on the Constitution, and how even today, there's still roles that each of us can play in engaging with our lawmakers at each branch of the federal government. So I will be happy to go to the next slide. So the U.S. Constitution basically grants legislative powers to Congress. Of course, Congress consists of the House of Representatives and the United States Senate. That is one of the branches of government that we'll talk about. That's the legislative branch. And I think it was really great to make sure that power wouldn't be concentrated, that decisions were made to give, specific powers to the specific branches to really create a balance. And we will use that term, checks and balances, which means no one part of the government can do certain things that another part of the government cannot check, which I think was brilliant in terms of how that was set up. And also living in a country where we have a separation of powers, where there is a balance. There is no branch more powerful than the other. And they all really function in certain ways to make the entire system, I think, really, really work well. And I will say that being able to have the different branches of government have separate powers and the ability to keep each branch accountable is really a critical piece of really what makes our United States government and really our country a great place to live. Next slide. So I thought it'd be good to illustrate to you the three branches of government in terms of quickly some of the key things that they do. Of course, the legislative branch, and most of us are aware of that. That would be, as I mentioned before, made up of the House and the Senate. And frankly, they make laws. And when you think about making laws, that's one line there, but there's a major process that goes into that. And I do want to spend a little bit of time on that because I think sometimes in the media, in the news, we hear things happen. Well, they happen too slow, or sometimes, oh my God, they made this decision very fast. The bottom line is whenever a law is being made, there's some proposal that's put on the table, which means that if I'm a congressman and my constituent they will come to me and say, hey, I want you to take care of this issue. It's really something that would move our community forward. Then I would look to think, can I do that legislatively? Is it a regulatory issue? Is it a judicial issue? Okay, this is something I can handle on the legislative side. So in that sense, I would introduce a bill. That bill, once it's introduced, it goes to a committee. If I'm in the House, it's going to go to one of the House committees in the House, and the committees have jurisdiction over different issues. One may be spending, one may be taxes, the other may be health and human services. But the bottom line is I will draft a bill, and that bill will, once I introduce it on the floor, it will be referred to a committee. At that point, a committee will hold what you call a markup, a hearing first. So they will want to hear and learn more about the legislation, bring people in to testify, to talk about the pros and cons. From there, if the bill were to advance, once it advances, it would go to what you call a markup. A markup is really where the committee considers the bill. And the majority, which is now the Republicans, they are all the committee chairs or committee chairs. The Democrats are the ranking members. So that means they're second in line because they're in the minority. And so from that standpoint, if we were to get to a markup, that means that the committee would eventually vote on the bill, whether or not to advance it, for House consideration or in the Senate for Senate consideration. If the bill is approved, then it would be scheduled for consideration on the floor. And the way the House functions, it has a rules committee. So there would be rules implemented around the debate on that bill in terms of, things that can be discussed, the number of amendments and all of that. So as you hear me say this, you probably notice that there are multiple steps that we have to take to get to legislation that you would eventually want signed by the president if it's something that's of interest to you. So there is that process, and that process, there's really no time limit. Some things move faster than others. Some things move slower than others. It just depends. I will say that's where advocacy comes in. I worked on a number of bills where we needed to push it and push a little bit quick, and there was pressure applied. I think we'll talk about advocacy and activism later on, but I think it was a combination of both of those things that end up having that happen. And the bottom line, so once a bill is taken up, the key thing is there has to be a negotiation and what we call a conference between the House and Senate to finalize a bill to send to the president to sign. So it just can't be the House passes a bill and sends it to the president or the Senate. Eventually they both have to agree on this legislation that will go to the president to be signed into law. Of course, legislatively, there are appointments that are made, presidential appointments. that are made within the federal government. So that's really important to know. Of course, there are 435 representatives in the House. There are 2 senators from each state. And I will say that the 435, the number of congressmen that you would have, House members you would have, is based on population. Each state gets, will always have at this point, 2 senators. And so, again, that's really how it's made up. That's sort of the reasoning behind the structure of Congress. If you go over to the executive branch, of course, the president signs laws, but one of those checks and balances that we talk about here would be his ability to veto. The checks and balances that the House would have would be the ability to override his veto. So again, that just it gives you another illustration of how powers can be checked and how there is a balance. Of course, you probably heard in the news during the last, even during the last couple of administrations, where people have been pardoned, may have been had charges against them or in prison. They've been able to be pardoned for those things. And lately, judges have been all the rage and been all the talk. Federal judges are, of course, appointed by the executive, in which the president sits. So he nominates these folks, and then they would be confirmed or not confirmed by the Senate. And of course, House members elected every 2 years, senators every 6 years. And the reason for the senators being elected every 6 years is because, it's a more deliberate body and they need more time to study things. Whereas I think House members are seen or seen to be closer to the people. So, there needs to be a more frequent election cycle in the House. And you're probably about now receiving lots or you will be receiving mailers and emails and texts about people running for office. So because we're headed into that season now. On the judicial side, the judicial side is very interesting because it's able to check the legislative and the executive branches in terms of whether the laws they pass and the regulations that they make are constitutional. And if not, perhaps maybe, we need to do away with those laws. And I think the key thing, too, with the judicial branch is that, they want to make sure that we had civil liberties here in this country, but at the same time have a balance between how laws are implemented, how they're put into place and how they really affect us as a people. Of course, there are 9 justices that sit on the Supreme Court. They are nominated by the president and confirmed or not confirmed by the U.S. Senate. And the other thing is that the Supreme Court, it says supreme, and that means it is pretty much king over all of the other courts, and it can't overturn rulings by other courts as well. And I'll go back into the administrative branch a little bit. When you think of the executive branch, the president is really our head of state. The president is our commander in chief, and he's really oversees the day-to-day management of the federal government through the agencies. And of course, these are all, there will be secretaries of these agencies, and those are people that he works with because he's nominated them and believes that he can work with them to carry out his mission. So that's, and I'll talk probably a little bit later, that agencies, the importance of agencies. I think we think so much about Congress and the president, but we do need to dig deeper in terms of agencies because they have pretty much an impact on our everyday life. Next slide, please. So I did cover some of this. I may have talked ahead a little bit, but anyway, this is just sort of a quick 3 bullet points of what these chambers do, the 2 chambers do. I think one of the key things that I pointed out here is, the making of laws, but even bigger than that, that matters to a lot of us who advocate and are activists on the Hill, is the appropriation of funds. And what that means is, how Congress pretty much doles out its monies for different programs, say for infrastructure, for health and human services, for mental health programs, as well as transportation and water infrastructure. So that's very important in terms of sort of following where the money is. And typically some of that is going to be tied around the president's priorities, but also Congress has priorities too. And at the end of the day, Congress really gets to decide where a lot of those funds are going to go. And the president at that point can say, hey, I don't like these bills, I'll veto them, or he may, negotiate with them to get to a point where they can agree. And I will say this about Congress too. It's really designed for you to compromise. I mean, the way that it's built. So when you hear that compromise is sort of a dirty word, it's really not. The body, I think, long ago when it was set up to bring people together to be able to compromise. You don't always get what you want, but maybe you will get the best thing for the people of this country. And the other things here would be taxation, which some people don't want to talk about taxes. But yes, Congress does oversee taxation. There will be from time to time presidents who want to lower taxes. There are presidents who want to raise them. Again, it's all about what their priorities are and what their vision is for the country. And of course, we're dealing with, wartime, in Europe and over, in Israel and in that area, in the Middle East. So that's important in terms of who declaring war. You just don't say you want to go to war. It has to be declared as a formal process for that, as well as regulating commerce. Next slide. As I mentioned, there are committees of jurisdiction, and when I mention the word jurisdiction, that means there are certain issues that I would oversee. If I were the committee chair in the House and I oversaw, the House Commerce Committee, I would deal with healthcare issues there or commerce issues. If I was the committee chair in the Senate over the Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee, and I had a great interest in things around healthcare, I would have jurisdiction over those issues. Or if I was on the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, that means I'm interested in, or I would have jurisdiction or some powers over transportation in this country, whether it's to authorize more funding for transportation or whether it's to deal with unsafe planes or railroads or whatever the case may be. I would have jurisdiction over those issues on that particular committee. And, there's been landmark legislation passed all through the history of Congress. I think some of the things now, because of where we are with, health care and really, voting rights and civil rights, I pointed out those two pieces of legislation or areas of legislation as actions that have been taken by Congress in the past that I think have been monumental. And the other thing Congress can do, as we've seen it in a number of administrations, and a president can be impeached. Of course, to be removed, he would have to be convicted, and the Senate would have to convict him. But you have seen impeachments, not only president, as you may have seen lately, that the DHS secretary, Department of Homeland Security secretary, was impeached. So the House impeached him. Of course, he was not convicted in the Senate. And I would say that even as you look at all of this, the key thing here is that you vote to elect these folks to represent you. So, you can hold them accountable. And when I say hold them accountable, you really want to track the things that they're doing for your cause or what you stand for your community. And if they're not doing those things, you can write them, you can meet with them, you can meet with their staff. They hold town halls. You can end up going into their district offices. Senators, they have offices all across the states. So again, there's a chance for you to be heard. I think often people say, well, they're going to do what they want to do, so it doesn't really matter. It does matter. There have been some elections. I was talking to someone last week, I think, and this was in a local election. I think it was decided by like 12 votes. And so, you got to think about every vote does count when it comes into this. So remember, your vote is your ticket to accountability for those folks that represent you. And I think you should take advantage of that and let them know that. Next slide, please. As I mentioned before, the day-to-day management of the government, of really our country, and how laws are are implemented or administrated is really through the executive branch. And there are tons of federal agencies. You can think about, I just mentioned Health and Human Services. There's the Department of Commerce. There's USDA, U.S. Department of Agriculture, Department of Commerce, Department of Transportation, Department of Housing and Urban Development. Actually, I get to work with a lot of those different agencies all across, even the White House, going there to work with them on certain things too. So I think the bottom line is these federal agencies also are able, based when these laws are passed, they can also implement regulations that can be good for you. And sometimes you may not agree with those regulations. They could be things that affect the environment through EPA, Environmental Environment Protection Agency, or there could be things through the Department of Education in terms of, the Pell grants in terms of, how that program is administered. So the bottom line is those agencies are really important. And I find too, again, there are people there to contact if you have issues within an agency that you want to resolve versus on Capitol Hill. Again, you're a taxpayer and you do pay their salaries. And for the most part, I found that most of the agencies are really open to talking with you. And if there's an issue that they can solve, they're willing to work with you to do that. But remember, through all of that, they're put in place to really advance the priorities of the president. And there are various ways that they're able to do that, maybe through outreach, through regulations, through tweaking grant programs that you may have an interest in as well. The president too can issue executive orders, and I know people will say, well, this president issued all these executive orders, and he can do this and he can do that. But I will say this: they can be very beneficial, but at the same time, it's not the force of law. So if there's really an issue like immigration that I really want to reform, yeah, I can use executive orders as a tool, but really comprehensively, you'll want to have the House and Senate pass legislation to really do something and enshrine some new policies that would really help with an issue like immigration or a big healthcare issue or voting rights, something like that. And of course, then if you notice, we have a Secretary of State, the president, they get involved with foreign policy negotiations. Even the Department of Defense can be involved with those kinds of things as well. So again, the executive branch is a critical piece of this three-legged stool that we talk about. So I want to make sure that, again, they are open for business as well if there are issues that you need to attend to within those agencies. Next slide. And in terms of the judicial branch, again, it's really what are the laws that we have that are on the books and how should we interpret those? And the key thing is we want to make sure that everyone is treated fairly in terms of how these laws and rules are applied. And I think that's the balance that the court typically tries to seek. Any court would. But the bottom line is, you have to have a branch of government that's aside from the administration, that's separate from Congress, that can objectively look at laws and look at their impacts there. And the other thing, as I mentioned earlier, it's really important to make sure that the federal government is operating within the confines of the Constitution and not outside of that. Supreme Court is one that would enforce that particular procedure, just to make sure that, hey, you've passed these laws, but we have to make sure they align with the Constitution. And at the end of the day, there are different court levels. I can get into the Supreme Court and federal courts, there are appellate courts, there's tax courts. But at the end of the day, the Supreme Court rules and will have final say on even the constitutionality of laws that even these courts would have the chance to examine. Next slide. And there's my contact information there. And I look forward to the question answer period. If there are things I didn't cover, I look forward to cover those once we get to the question and answer period. Thank you.
Thank you, Ron, for that dive into our government and how it operates. At this juncture, I'd like to turn things over to Chelsey Cartwright, who's going to speak to us more about advocacy and how we can get involved. Chelsey?
Thank you so much, Sean, for the warm introduction, and apologies on my being a little tardy this evening. I had a few tech difficulties, but I'm looking forward to being here and being in community with you all this evening. So I'd like to talk a little bit about empowering voters, educating voters, engaging voters, and how that all plays a role in sustaining our democracy. When voters come together and mobilize in order to make things viable for our democracy, that's when it flourishes the most. And I'd like to start off to ground us with this quote from First Lady Michelle Obama. We all play a role in this democracy. We need to remember the power of every vote I continue to keep myself connected to a force that is larger and more potent than any one election or leader or news story, and that's optimism. For me, this is a form of faith, an antidote to fear. Next slide, please. So, really, essentially, we all know our vote is our voice. It's a way we can mobilize and affect change, we can affect hope, and we can transform what we most believe in terms of issues that stand out to us. We can transfer that into the ballot at the ballot box. So, voting is our chance to raise our voice on the issues that affect us in our communities the most. The power of voting is strong, and it plays a critical and viable role in sustaining our democracy. And democracy thrives when voters are active. So it really makes the difference to be active, vote in every election, and make sure that folks are mobilized and engaged in the electoral process. Voting in primary and general elections gives voters a chance to affect change and rally for issues that stand out to them. So it really makes the difference to be able to be mobilized, be a voter that stands for something, and that lifts your voice to make your vote count. Next slide, please. So now I'll talk a little bit about staying active during elections. Elections are not just about voting, and although voting is the most top tier form of how we can get our voices heard and actualize our values, there are other ways to be involved and engaged in the electoral process. So whether that's volunteering as a poll worker or poll observer, the league is very committed to both of these actions because they're learning experiences. It's able for folks, there are opportunities for folks to get engaged in their community and get a better sense of the electoral process firsthand. And they're nonpartisan opportunities and ways to be objective when at the polling places. Keeping lines of communication open with your local election officials, making sure that you have an open line of communication where you can build relationships with election officials is really important. Ask them questions, get to know them and their staff, make sure that they know what you care about, what your community is caring about in terms of leading up to local elections. And then promoting civic engagement and education. Whether that's volunteering with folks in your community to get them engaged in a voting plan, or whether that's you know hosting or attending a candidate forum to learn more about candidates' platforms. Just making sure that folks are understanding how best to stay active and engaged. Staying connected to your local board of election will equip you with information on local elections and how best to understand the process of local elections and how they function. And then activate others. Be a source of a trusted messenger in your community about elections and about how best to amplify the message of voting and elections across your network. Next slide, please. And again, other ways to stay engaged. Ask if your local board of elections has a community advisory committee. These committees are wonderful resources to be present in understanding the nuance of how elections are function, understand how folks can get involved on a local level, and provide feedback to their local elections officials on what works best, what's not working, opportunities, challenges. If you have a specific question, I encourage you to plan a meeting and sit down to talk through what might be the question that you have. And then that could also open itself up to becoming a poll observer or a poll worker. Those are excellent opportunities to also get involved on the local level. And more often than not, folks need access to accurate on-point election information about voting and elections. And so the League has a tool called Vote 411, which is a one-stop shop for election information, for all the resources you need, top of the ballot all the way down the ballot. And I encourage everyone to check out Vote 411 as a resource. And it can really equip you with the information that you may need on a candidate, on a race, and how best to get plugged in that sense. And last slide, please. So when you check out Vote 411, as I mentioned, it's a one-stop shop. The first step is to make a voting plan. Make a voting plan that speaks to how you're going to get to the polling place. If you want to bring a friend or a family member with you to the polling place to vote as together, make those proper plans to put that in action. So you have a plan of action. And then on Vote 411, there's different steps to get involved. You can check your registration status and or register to vote if you need to. Learn about early voting options. You can check that across states, across counties. Explore your day of voting options. So again, when you make your plan to vote, you can, check out all the steps that you're going to take to make those plans to vote. Research candidates, and then share your plans to mobilize others and activate others in your network and community to get engaged. So these are a few resources that are on the Vote 411 website and also on the League of Women Voters national website. There's some great resources on election preparation. So when it's GOTV, get out the vote mode. These are different tools and resources that will be helpful to you when planning your vote. So that's the end of my presentation here, but really encourage everyone to be active, to be engaged, and knowing that our vote is our voice, and mobilizes others to do the same is a really powerful tool for the greater good. So I'll hand it back over to you, Sean, and thank you.
Thank you so much, Chelsey. You certainly provided us a slew of very practical ways that we can get engaged, so we appreciate that. I'd like to kind of toss around some questions if you don't mind. Chelsey, one of the things you mentioned was that people should vote in every election. But I would venture to say that the majority of times we see that surge when it is the year of a presidential election, like we're experiencing this year. What could organizations or individuals themselves do to kind of encourage others to get involved beyond that every 4 years, to get out there doing midterm elections, and to also perhaps engage in state and local elections as well?
Absolutely. I would encourage folks to be aware of the elections that are happening each year and to be more involved on a grassroots level, be more involved on a community-based level. We know that folks know their communities more intimately, more in on a grassroots level that anyone else could know them. So we encourage folks at the league to take the steps to get to know the issues that are affecting day-to-day life, whether that's the quality of schools or whether that's healthcare or property taxes or affordable housing. Knowing the issues on the local level will encourage folks to vote more often, I believe. And so understanding how grassroots activism and how grassroots advocacy can come together to mobilize folks to vote is where we are in terms of seeing those numbers rise. Because to your point, elections happen every year, and we want to encourage everyone to be engaged and mobilized year after year. And so they become voters each year and in every election.
Thank you. I had a question for Ron. Ron, we touched upon the role of committees in Congress and committees of jurisdiction. Just how do members of Congress kind of get those roles and the hierarchy that goes into that and so forth? Can you walk us through that a little bit?
Yes, so it's important, and I will throw out a fact that we know typically when you look at those roles, I mean, seniority has a lot to do with it, but how much money you raise has a lot to do with it too. I mean, we'll see publication that will say X member, he really wants to be or she really wants to be chair. She's raised this amount of money, on these issues, which she would have or he would have jurisdiction over in Congress. And it's also how much you work to help other members get elected as well too. I think I've met some members here, surprisingly, that have come in here even as freshmen and that have been on choice committees. But I found out they have they were candidates that did well in their elections, but also on the road helping other people be elected. So I think you really have to look at it as a team game, and you have to sort of be selfish in terms of wanting those committee appointments, but you just don't walk in and go to the top of the heap. You have to earn it in several different ways. And I would just say back on the question you had that you posed to Chelsey, I worked in local government, and she's exactly right, and you're right. I think there needs to be an education, and whether it's civic organizations or churches or whoever, not to tell people who to vote for, but to really educate them on the importance of elections at the local, state, and federal level. And because there's so many things that hit you every day locally that if you don't watch out who you're voting for, that's going to actually get to you quicker, the impacts of that, I think, than some of the federal stuff. So I believe, and I met with a congressional aide for a congressman this morning, and we talked about the same kinds of things. And I think he said, we're going to do exactly what you were talking about. And I think also bringing things, whether it's at the state, federal, or local level, really telling people simply how these policies impact your life, your day-to-day life. I think we have to do a better job in doing that. Then they would have an interest in voting in all of these elections.
Yeah, indeed. I had another question. Certainly, I know from our perspective, when we are trying to engage advocates to reach out to their members of Congress, to their senators, one of the arguments is always to make sure that they share their story, to share that personal connection to the issue. But on the flip side, what research can advocates do behind the scenes to find out if there is a member or an incoming member that has specific connection to their issue? Perhaps if there is a member that is a pediatrician initially, and we're working on the child health bill. How pertinent is it to kind of do the research and find out those things in order to kind of build a greater relationship with those congressional offices, and therefore kind of maybe, because they have a vested interest, then perhaps they're more inclined to support the legislation that you're coming to them with?
I think along those lines, and we do a lot of that for clients, before we take someone in to meet or we have an issue, we sort of look at, what caucuses are these? Number one, what's their profession? Where do they come from? What caucuses are they a part of? Even down to what kind of pin do they wear on their lapel representing some organization. Sometimes you'll see those things. So, we do a lot of research to figure out, what they have done before they came to Congress to sort of get an idea of what their interests are. And then, of course, it depends on what committee that they're on as well. But I think those are the things that, need to be put into a briefing book or one page or something. So when people study before they go in, they know, yep, congressman, congresswoman, she did this when she was in Texas, and she was on this. She did pass this legislation in the state house. She's this is where she is on this issue, and then you can determine. Yeah, we know where they are, but maybe there are some people that we need to convince to come to our side. So I think that research needs to be done in advance. The other thing too, the other thing I would say too is that it's important to assess the relationships that they have with other folks, whether it's in their community or even across the country. I've gained a lot from putting relationships together to get someone to influence a member. So that's very, very important, I think, or someone in the community that they're in that has their ear. Those are the kinds of things you have to be able to determine if you want to be effective in moving people on some of these issues.
Right. Thank you. Chelsey, I had a quick question for you. I think we often hear the two words advocacy and we hear the word activism. Can you differentiate between the two? Because I think typically they're often used synonymously when that may not be an appropriate use of either word.
Right, I agree. I think there's a lot of interplay between both advocacy and activism. But I'd like to say that I think advocacy is the more formal way in which folks lobby, folks push for issues that are important to them. They work within the current framework of the laws and of our government in order to push things forward. And activism to me is more grassroots, more direct action. It's more uh, of course, they both advocacy and activism are issue based and issue oriented, but activism is more boots on the ground, rolling your sleeves up to get that action done, while advocacy uses more of the soft power, uses more relationship building, and kind of finding the ways in which to plug into the system that is already there to be able to affect change. I think those are the differences between those two.
And is it possible? I mean, do you see one having greater effect than the other? Or is the best case scenario to use both mechanisms simultaneously?
I think I would agree with using them both simultaneously. I think it's a both and situation where advocates paired with activists can really affect and mobilize change for the better. And working together as one to know that many advocates started as activists, and many activists are aiming to be advocates or already advocates. So understanding the interplay there, how both an advocate and an activist are are centered in moving things ahead and moving things in the right direction in terms of the causes they support. Just doing it in different ways, but I think it does take the complexities of both to come together and mobilize to affect change and encourage growth in terms of systems of government.
Great, thank you. Ron, I did have one more question for you. We talked about the committees and so forth, and to some extent about the executive branch. In that context, can you share a little with us about cabinet, the president's cabinet, how he may be deciding that, and what role they actually play in kind of policy making or advancing the president's agenda?
Okay. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so the president, you have to have, although, I didn't mention he sort of oversees everything, but at the end of the day, you have to have cabinet secretaries. For instance, I've worked a lot with HUD, Housing Urban Development, on homelessness issues and affordable housing. Well, he has these ideas about ending homelessness and decreasing and increasing the supply of housing. But policies, you have policies, but then you have to have someone implement those policies. So, and you probably want to look at people that have expertise in those areas. Not all the time. I mean, sometimes, I'll be honest with you, some of these secretaries, they have raised money. They've had great relationships with the president, and that will lead to that. I've seen some that where I was like, I can't believe that person is going to be secretary of this agency. And there have been some that have been excellent. Just we're happy to see those picks, but the president does rely on the secretaries quite a bit. And when there is legislation and policy that they try to move, I think they become advocates. You will see them on the road. You will see the Department of Commerce secretary out dealing with the Chips and Science Act. At least pushing it for people to advocate that Congress pass it. And then on top of that, going out with the big checks and going to projects to tout, hey, we did this and we've accomplished those things. So I think you also want secretaries, and even I would say even the Department of Justice, even the Attorney General. You want people that are aligned with you in terms of your mission and your goals for this country. But relationships play a big role in that. I would say relationships and expertise play a major role. And really, do you connect with, with the president on what he's trying to do?
Great, thank you. I believe there's questions in the Q&A or the chat. Joy, am I correct in that?
You are correct. So we have our first question here from Sumuka in the chat. And can you talk a little bit about the rulemaking process within federal agencies and how people can shape the decisions through the public comment process?
Yes, very good question. So, of course, when there are laws that are passed, they have to be implemented. Typically, there are regulations that come along with those. So, basically, what will happen is there will be the agencies again, that these secretaries are in charge of. They will draft rules. So there will be draft rules that will come out. You will have a chance to submit comments on those draft proposals. And frankly, I've done that for clients, and we've had some times where our comments, they did matter and there were things that were tweaked in the rules. There have been lots of times where they thanked us for our comments and, we didn't necessarily see it reflected there, but that doesn't mean that someone else's ideas were not. I can use an example. We went to, there was a program that they were issuing rules for at the Department of Education. We went and mentioned why there were some improvements that could be made to this program. And those program folks then said, hey, I think this actually is a good idea. And so when they promulgated those rules, that was reflective. Our suggestions were reflective in that. So that's just an example of, that wasn't on Capitol Hill. That was in an agency on a program that mattered in terms of what we were trying to accomplish. And so there will be time limits on terms of those rules. And then, there's sort of a dog period after that in terms of how long it will be before the rule actually takes place and become permanent. All that stuff is noticed in the Federal Register. So you get the notices of when these are going to go into effect. And sometimes rules can be delayed as well it just depends on what's happening in an agency, or maybe they're getting a lot of feedback from folks and they need to take a closer look. But rulemaking, you can weigh in. It's easier now. It used to be like you had to write everything and send it in, and now with the web, you can put your comments in, right on a website. And so it's not as tedious as it used to be back when I first started doing this work in the 90s.
Great. Thanks, Ron. Just another quick question about Congress and the Senate. How much are individual members kind of in a place where they can kind of advance agendas of their own, or particularly as freshman members, how beholden are they to their respective parties in terms of advancing policy and specific agenda items?
Typically, I think I've come across some freshmen, they're happy to be here and they just start introducing bills, all over the place. I think at the end of the day, if you're a freshman coming, number one, you need to get to know the lay of the land. And you're probably going to be, partial to the people that help you get here, likely in your party. And you want to sort of figure out how things work. So you don't want to, I would say, throw too many rocks at the beginning. You want to sort of figure out, where things are here. But I will say too, I've seen some freshmen, as one of them that I've met with on a number of occasions. I was reading about him recently, and he had passed some pretty substantial legislation, but he did that with the help of more senior people around him too. So I think he built a really good coalition in terms of the folks he needed. Of course, the committee chair was on his side as well, but I think he did a really good job, even as a freshman, to be able to work on something to the extent that he did and to get it passed. So I think that was pretty monumental, a pretty good accomplishment. But typically, you might say, oh, I have a freshman member and we're never going to get anything done. Not necessarily true, because you don't know, that freshman member could be a prodigious fundraiser. Maybe he could have an issue going on within his district that the leadership is interested in. They could see him as a rising star and they want to help him move up. So there are a lot of different things that play. And I think, again, it's really who you align yourself with and who they build those relationships to advance their agenda or their constituents' agenda.
Great, thanks so much. Jory, is there another question or comment in the chat?
Yes, there is another question. There's actually a couple more questions for you. So, Pamela asks, what is the purpose of the electoral voting? We, the people who vote, should have the last word, is the question that Pamela asks. Why aren't we, the people who have the last word?
Well, I think, and I'll take a whack at this. Part of it is, you want to have, everyone across this country sort of have an opportunity to weigh in, in terms of electing a president. So, you set up the system with electors, you need 270 electoral votes. I think, of course, not all the states are the same size, but they all have 2 senators. So I think a lot of that was, you didn't want the bigger areas just to really just influence how people, or at least how the president's elected. And then, of course, there was, I think it's the 23rd Amendment that deals with the Electoral College. But the bottom line is, I agree. I hear the case more and more that people are saying we elect, everyone else in this country is elected by majority vote. I mean, and so why isn't the president? And I think back in the time that they put the Electoral College into place, probably made sense. I think, we've evolved as a country since then. If it was up to me, I agree. I would prefer that there be elections based on the number of votes, popular vote. And I would say rather than have 3 or 4 states pretty much determine who our president is going to be. And I don't know, that would, you have to change the Constitution and all that to do that. And I don't think there would be, I think there are members of Congress who want to do it, but I can tell you that I know some that definitely, this is an advantage to them in terms of the way the system is set up. So I don't think that'll be something that'll change, anytime soon. I don't believe. But again, it was really to try to create a type of equity. But I think now it's sort of on the reverse side, that I think it'd be more equitable if we were electing by the popular vote. But then again, people would say, hey, all the bigger states are going to have all the power. And if I'm in Idaho or Wyoming or somewhere, it's not going to count as much for me. I won't have the same shot that everyone else has. So that's sort of why I think the Electoral College is. There have been some studies about doing some, making some changes or even getting rid of it. I just don't see that right now where we are right now.
Jory, was there another question?
Yes, I have another question for you. So for someone who is holding a leadership role in their community and might be finding themselves speaking to legislators, what kind of advice can you offer for someone in that position, speaking to legislators?
Well, first thing I would say is do your homework before you go in. You should prepare messages if you're only going to have 3 to 5 minutes, or really, I sometimes say 1 to 3 minutes to tell them exactly what you want. The other thing I would say too is don't get caught up in so much small talk in these meetings, because 2 things. 1, you never know when a staffer is going to come and tell him he has to leave or she has to leave the room. So I always tell clients to get to what you want as soon as possible. Sometimes members will use small talk as, I hate to say it, as a delay tactic. And next thing you know, your time is gone and you didn't get to something. Typically, if that's an issue that they are not in favor of, that you want. So I would say that. And also, make sure you know what their position is or how they feel about the issue that you're going in to talk about. And if you have any data is king these days. So any data or stats that you have to back up your position would be helpful. But I always say, be fast, be quick, get to the point, have data and stats to back up your position. And, also make an invitation for them to meet with you on their turf in the district as well. And make sure you also, before I would come to meet or talk to them, I would meet with the staff in advance of meeting with a member.
Great advice. Jory, is there anything else?
We actually would like to move to our next item on the agenda, which is very exciting. So I will turn it back over to you. I think we've answered everyone's questions that we have come through in the Q&A and chat. And please feel free again to send us a message at advocacy@mda.usa, mdausa.org, excuse me, if we can answer anything else for you. But Sean, I will let you introduce our video presentation this evening.
Yes, as I may have mentioned earlier, tonight's Advocacy Institute is the premier event for MDA's Access the Vote campaign, which launched last week. We will be doing activities. We have a microsite up as a resource for a great deal of information for our advocates. I hope you bring other people to the page. It will be mda.org/vote. And that being said, before we play the video, I just want to thank Ron and Chelsey again for giving up your evening to be with us and to share your expertise. I think it has been invaluable. I know I learned a great deal, and I certainly hope those participating learned a great deal as well. So with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and ask Jory to play the video. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Enjoy the rest of your evening and be sure to access the vote. Good night.